Burma, 1944. Monsoon rains hammered the jungle canopy with relentless fury, turning dirt paths into rivers of mud and transforming the dense vegetation into a steaming, impenetrable maze. Through this green hell, a British patrol moved cautiously, their boots squelching with each step as they navigated the treacherous terrain. The sound of their movement was masked by the constant drumming of rain on leaves, a natural camouflage that had become both blessing and curse in this theater of war. Sergeant William Hayes wiped the moisture from his eyes and squinted through the downpour. His unit, part of the 14th Army under General Slim, had been conducting reconnaissance operations along the Chindwin River Valley, monitoring Japanese troop movements as enemy forces began their gradual retreat from Burma. The monsoon season of 1944 had arrived with its usual vengeance, turning military operations into exercises in endurance as much as strategy. The campaign in Burma had been unlike anything the British Empire had faced before. Unlike the desert warfare of North Africa or the urban combat of Europe, this was a war fought in conditions that seemed designed to break both body and spirit. Temperatures soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit during the day, only to plummet at night when the rains came. Diseases like malaria, dysentery, and dengue fever claimed more casualties than enemy bullets. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of hostile terrain, making every meal, every bullet, every bandage a precious commodity. The 14th Army, known as the Forgotten Army, had earned its nickname through years of fighting in what many considered a secondary theater of war. While headlines focused on the European Front and the Pacific Island campaigns, British, Indian, African, and Australian troops battled through some of the most challenging conditions imaginable. The jungle was an enemy in itself, harboring diseases that could fell a man faster than any bullet, concealing dangers that could strike without warning, and testing the limits of human endurance with its oppressive heat and humidity. Behind Hayes, 5 soldiers struggled through the undergrowth, their Lee Enfield rifles held high to keep them dry. Private Tommy Morrison, barely 19 and still adjusting to the brutal realities of jungle warfare, stumbled over a hidden root and caught himself against a bamboo stand. The sound echoed briefly before being swallowed by the rain. Morrison had arrived in Burma just 3 months earlier, part of a replacement draft sent to fill the gaps left by casualties and disease. His letters home spoke of homesickness and confusion, of a war that bore no resemblance to the heroic narratives he had grown up hearing. The young private had enlisted with dreams of glory, inspired by stories of his father's service in the Great War. But the reality of jungle warfare bore little resemblance to the tales of heroic charges and clear victories that had shaped his expectations. Here, victory was measured in miles gained through swamp and jungle, in supply lines maintained despite constant harassment, in the simple act of surviving another day in an environment that seemed determined to kill you. Corporal James Fletcher, a veteran of the North African campaign, shot Morrison a warning glance. Fletcher had seen action at El Alamein and understood the difference between desert warfare and jungle combat. In the desert, you could see your enemy coming from miles away. Here, death could lurk behind any tree, in any shadow. The Japanese had proven themselves masters of camouflage and ambush tactics, turning the jungle itself into a weapon. Fletcher carried with him the hard-won wisdom of multiple campaigns. He had learned to read the subtle signs that distinguish safety from danger, to recognize the difference between the natural sounds of the jungle and the artificial quiet that often preceded an ambush. His experience had taught him that survival depended not just on courage and training, but on constant vigilance and an almost supernatural awareness of one's surroundings. The other members of the patrol represented the diverse composition of British forces in Burma. Private Davies, a Welsh coal miner before the war, had developed an uncanny ability to navigate through the densest vegetation. His experience working underground had given him an intuitive understanding of confined spaces and dangerous environments. Lance Corporal Williams, formerly a clerk from Manchester, had surprised everyone with his aptitude for jungle survival. The methodical mind that had served him well in civilian bureaucracy proved equally valuable in the systematic approach required for jungle warfare. Private Singh, a Sikh soldier from the Punjab regiment, served as their interpreter and liaison with local populations. His knowledge of multiple languages and his understanding of Asian cultures made him invaluable in a theater where the line between friend and foe was often blurred. Singh had joined the British Indian Army, with a complex mixture of motivations, including economic necessity, family tradition, and a genuine belief in the Allied cause, despite the contradictions inherent in fighting for freedom while serving a colonial power. The diversity of the patrol reflected the truly international character of the Burma campaign. Soldiers from across the British Empire had been brought together to fight in this remote corner of the world, creating a military force that was more cosmopolitan than any other in British history. This diversity brought both challenges and advantages, as different cultural perspectives and experiences contributed to a more nuanced understanding of the complex political and social dynamics of the region. As they crested a small ridge, the patrol emerged into a clearing where the remains of a bombed-out village lay scattered like broken teeth. Thatched roofs had collapsed under the weight of water and neglect, and the few remaining walls stood as silent monuments to the civilian cost of war. The village had been caught between opposing forces multiple times during the campaign, changing hands as the front lines shifted back and forth across the Burmese countryside. Evidence of the Japanese occupation was everywhere. Propaganda posters, now faded and torn, still clung to some walls, their messages of Asian liberation and anti-Western sentiment barely visible through the damage of weather and neglect. A small shrine had been converted into a military checkpoint, with sandbags and firing positions still visible despite months of abandonment. The villagers had long since fled, some to refugee camps behind British lines, others deeper into the jungle where they hoped to wait out the war in relative safety. The destruction told a story of the brutal reality of occupation and liberation. Japanese forces had initially been welcomed by some Burmese as liberators from British colonial rule, but the harsh realities of military occupation had quickly soured these relationships. Forced labor, requisitioning of food and supplies, and brutal treatment of suspected resistance fighters had turned much of the population against their supposed liberators. When British forces began their counteroffensive, many villages found themselves caught in the crossfire, their inhabitants forced to choose sides or flee. It was here, in the shadow of a partially destroyed Buddhist shrine, that they saw her. A figure sat motionless in the rain, back pressed against the crumbling stone foundation of what had once been someone's home. Even from a distance, it was clear this was no local villager. The woman wore the remnants of what appeared to be a Japanese military uniform, though it was so waterlogged and mud-stained that its original color was impossible to determine. Her black hair hung in wet strands around her face, and her posture spoke of exhaustion beyond mere physical fatigue. But it was the sign beside her that stopped the patrol in their tracks. Crudely fashioned from a piece of torn canvas and propped against a bamboo stake, it bore a single word painted in unsteady English letters: enemy. Sergeant Hayes raised his fist, signaling the patrol to halt. For several long moments they remained frozen, studying the scene before them. The woman hadn't moved, hadn't even acknowledged their presence. She simply sat there, as still as the stone shrine behind her, letting the rain wash over her like some form of penance. The sight challenged everything they had been taught about the enemy they were fighting. Japanese propaganda had portrayed their soldiers as fanatically loyal, willing to die rather than surrender. Stories of kamikaze attacks and banzai charges had reinforced the image of an enemy that was fundamentally different from Western soldiers, driven by an alien code of honor that made normal human emotions irrelevant. Yet here was a Japanese soldier who had clearly been abandoned, left to face whatever fate the monsoon in the jungle might deliver. The sign beside her suggested that even her own people, or at least the local population, had rejected her presence. It was a scene that spoke of human vulnerability, rather than fanatical resistance. The image before them contradicted years of military training and propaganda. They had been conditioned to see the Japanese as an implacable foe, driven by a warrior culture that valued death before dishonor. The reality of a lone, abandoned woman sitting in the rain challenged these preconceptions in ways that no amount of briefings or intelligence reports could have prepared them for. Private Morrison whispered, "Sarge, what do we do?" It was a question that cut to the heart of everything they had been trained for, everything they believed about war and duty, and the clear lines that supposedly separated friend from foe. Military protocol was explicit. Enemy personnel were to be detained, searched, and transported to the nearest command post for interrogation. The woman before them was clearly Japanese, clearly military, and therefore clearly the enemy. But she was also clearly defenseless, abandoned, and suffering. Hayes had seen enough of war to know that reality rarely matched the neat categories of military manuals. During his 18 months in Burma, he had witnessed the complex web of loyalties and survival that governed life in occupied territory. He had seen Burmese civilians forced to collaborate with Japanese forces, only to be branded as traitors when British forces returned. He had encountered Japanese soldiers who had been left behind by retreating units, some fighting to the death, others surrendering with relief. The Burma campaign had been marked by numerous instances where the traditional rules of warfare had been complicated by local conditions and human factors. British forces had encountered Japanese soldiers who spoke perfect English, having been educated in Western universities before the war. They had found evidence of Japanese medical units treating wounded British prisoners according to international conventions. They had discovered letters and photographs that revealed the enemy to be young men missing their families, just like themselves. This woman represented something different, something that didn't fit easily into the established patterns of warfare. The sign beside her told a story of rejection and abandonment that transcended national boundaries. Someone, probably local villagers, had marked her as the enemy and left her to face whatever fate the monsoon and the jungle might deliver. The complexity of the situation reflected the broader moral ambiguities that characterized the Burma campaign. Unlike other theaters of war where the lines between good and evil seemed more clearly drawn, Burma presented a kaleidoscope of competing loyalties, survival strategies, and moral compromises. The Japanese occupation had been brutal, but it had also promised independence from colonial rule. The British return offered liberation from Japanese oppression, but also the restoration of colonial control. Local populations found themselves caught between these competing claims, forced to make impossible choices about loyalty and survival. Corporal Fletcher moved closer to Hayes. "Could be a trap, Sarge. Japanese are known for their deception tactics." Hayes nodded, understanding the concern. The Burma campaign had been marked by numerous instances of Japanese forces using unconventional tactics, including the deployment of female personnel in various capacities. Japanese intelligence had trained women to serve as spies and saboteurs, and there had been documented cases of female combatants participating in guerrilla operations. But as he studied the woman more carefully, Hayes saw no signs of concealed weapons, no indication of hostile intent. Her hands were visible and empty. Her posture spoke of exhaustion rather than readiness for combat. What he saw was a human being in desperate need of help. The decision he made in that moment would have consequences far beyond the immediate situation. It would challenge the assumptions of his men, surprise his superiors, and ultimately contribute to a pattern of behavior that would define British conduct in the final phases of the Burma campaign. British military culture in Burma had been shaped by a complex set of factors. The influence of officers who had served in India brought with them an understanding of cultural diversity and the importance of maintaining moral authority over subject populations. The presence of troops from across the British Empire, including Indians, Africans, and Australians, had created a more cosmopolitan military environment than existed in other theaters of war. General Slim himself had emphasized the importance of maintaining high moral standards, not just for strategic reasons but because he believed it was fundamental to British identity. His orders consistently stressed the humane treatment of prisoners and civilians, even when such treatment might complicate military operations. This emphasis on moral conduct was not merely idealistic. It served practical purposes in a theater where winning the support of local populations was crucial to military success. The 14th Army's approach to warfare had been influenced by the lessons learned from earlier campaigns, particularly the disastrous retreat from Burma in 1942. That defeat had been attributed not just to Japanese military superiority, but to the failure to maintain the loyalty and support of local populations. The return to Burma was therefore conceived not just as a military operation, but as an exercise in winning hearts and minds. Morrison, Fletcher, maintain perimeter watch, Hayes ordered quietly. Davies, check the surrounding buildings for any signs of enemy presence. Williams, you're with me. Singh, keep an eye on our flanks. As the patrol took their positions, Hayes approached the woman slowly, his rifle lowered but ready. Each step through the mud brought him closer to a confrontation with the moral complexities that war inevitably produced. The woman finally looked up as he drew near, her dark eyes reflecting a mixture of fear, resignation, and something that might have been hope. She was younger than he had initially thought, probably in her early 20s, with the kind of delicate features that spoke of education and refinement rather than military hardness. Her uniform, now that he could see it more clearly, bore the insignia of a medical corps auxiliary, suggesting she had been a nurse or medical assistant rather than a combat soldier. The Japanese military had employed thousands of women in support roles throughout their occupied territories. These women served as nurses, clerks, radio operators, and in various other capacities that freed up male personnel for combat duties. Many had been recruited from civilian populations in Japan, Korea, and other occupied territories, often with promises of good wages and the opportunity to serve their country. The recruitment of women for military service had been a controversial aspect of Japanese wartime policy. Traditional Japanese society had strict gender roles that confined women to domestic spheres, but the demands of total war had forced a reconsideration of these limitations. Women were increasingly called upon to fill roles previously reserved for men, from factory work to military support functions. Hayes stopped about 10 feet away and slowly removed his helmet, letting the rain fall directly on his graying hair. It was a gesture of respect, a signal that he came not as a conqueror, but as a fellow human being caught in the machinery of war. "Do you speak English?" he asked gently. The woman nodded slowly, then spoke in heavily accented but clear English. "Little bit. I was nurse. Japanese Medical Corps." Her admission confirmed what Hayes had suspected. During the Japanese occupation of Burma, medical personnel had been deployed throughout the region to support military operations and provide care for both Japanese forces and, in some cases, local populations. As the tide of war turned and Japanese forces began their strategic withdrawal, many of these auxiliary personnel had been left behind, considered non-essential to the retreat. The Japanese withdrawal from Burma had been conducted under increasingly desperate circumstances. Allied air superiority had made daylight movement extremely dangerous, forcing Japanese units to travel at night and abandon heavy equipment. Medical units, supply depots, and administrative personnel were often sacrificed to ensure that combat troops could escape encirclement. "What happened to you?" Hayes asked, crouching down to bring himself to her eye level. The woman's story emerged slowly, told in broken English supplemented by gestures and expressions that transcended language barriers. She had been stationed at a field hospital near Mandalay when the order came for all non-combat personnel to evacuate. But there had been no room in the trucks, no space on the boats crossing the Chindwin River. She had been told to wait for the next transport. But the next transport never came. Her name was Tanaka Michiko, and she had been serving as a medical auxiliary for nearly 2 years. She had volunteered for overseas service after completing nursing training in Osaka, motivated by a combination of patriotic duty and the desire for adventure. The reality of war had quickly dispelled any romantic notions she might have harbored about military service. The field hospital where she had worked treated not only Japanese soldiers but also wounded prisoners of war and local civilians caught in the fighting. She described the constant struggle to maintain medical supplies, the heartbreak of watching young men die from wounds that might have been treatable under better conditions, and the gradual realization that the war was not going as the propaganda had promised. Her experiences in the field hospital had exposed her to the true cost of war, in ways that civilian life in Japan never could have. She had seen young soldiers, barely older than herself, crying for their mothers as they died. She had witnessed the arbitrary nature of survival, where a few inches could mean the difference between life and death. She had learned to compartmentalize her emotions, to function professionally even when surrounded by suffering and death. For weeks after being abandoned, she had survived by hiding in abandoned buildings and foraging for food in the jungle. Local villagers, terrified of being associated with Japanese forces, had driven her away whenever she sought help. Some had threatened violence. Others had simply turned their backs and pretended not to see her. The local Burmese population had suffered greatly under Japanese occupation. Initial promises of independence and liberation from British colonial rule had quickly given way to harsh military administration, forced labor, and economic exploitation. By 1944, most Burmese civilians viewed the Japanese as oppressive occupiers and welcomed the return of British forces, despite their own complicated relationship with British colonial rule. The sign, she explained, had been placed by villagers who wanted to make clear to any returning British forces that they had not harbored the enemy. It was their insurance policy, their way of demonstrating loyalty to whoever might be in power next. The villagers had not been cruel in their rejection of her, merely practical. In a war zone, survival often depended on making the right political calculations. As she spoke, Hayes became aware of her physical condition. Her lips were cracked from dehydration, her hands shook with weakness, and her breathing was shallow and labored. She was suffering from exposure, malnutrition, and possibly the early stages of tropical disease. Without immediate care, she might not survive another week in the jungle. The Geneva Convention, which Britain had signed and committed to uphold, was clear about the treatment of prisoners of war. Article 4 specifically addressed the humane treatment of captured personnel, regardless of nationality or military status. But beyond legal obligations, Hayes found himself confronting a more fundamental question about the nature of humanity in warfare. British forces in Burma had generally maintained high standards in their treatment of prisoners, despite the brutal nature of the campaign and the documented atrocities committed by Japanese forces against Allied prisoners. This adherence to international law was not merely a matter of legal compliance, but reflected deeper values about British identity and moral authority. The treatment of prisoners had become a point of pride for British forces, distinguishing them from both their Japanese enemies and, in some cases, their own allies. Stories of Japanese brutality toward prisoners had reinforced British determination to maintain higher standards, both as a matter of moral principle and as a practical demonstration of the superiority of democratic values. He turned to Williams, who had been watching the exchange with growing amazement. "Give me your water bottle and some of those biscuits from your pack." Williams hesitated. "Sarge, are you sure about this? I mean, she's Japanese." "She's a human being," Hayes replied firmly, "and she's in need of help." The water bottle and emergency rations were passed forward, and Hayes offered them to the woman. Her reaction was immediate and profound. Tears mixed with rainwater on her cheeks as she accepted the gifts, her hands trembling as she lifted the water to her lips. She drank slowly, carefully, as if afraid the water might disappear if she consumed it too quickly. The simple act of sharing food and water had an immediate impact on the entire patrol. Morrison, who had initially been skeptical about approaching the woman, found himself digging through his pack for additional supplies. Fletcher, despite his concerns about security, began scanning the area for materials that might provide better shelter from the rain. But it was the woman's response that truly transformed the situation. As she regained some strength from the water and food, she began to speak more freely about her experiences. She told them about the patients she had treated, both Japanese soldiers and Burmese civilians caught in the crossfire of war. She described the field hospital where she had worked, where the primary concern had been healing rather than nationality. Her stories revealed the human cost of war from a perspective that none of the British soldiers had previously considered. They learned about Japanese soldiers who cried for their mothers as they died, about the fear and homesickness that transcended uniform and flag. They heard about acts of kindness between enemies, about shared cigarettes and photographs of families that looked remarkably similar regardless of which side of the conflict they represented. Private Singh, listening to the conversation, was particularly moved by her descriptions of treating wounded civilians. As a soldier from the Indian subcontinent, he understood the complex dynamics of colonial rule and liberation that had shaped the Burma campaign. Her stories reminded him that suffering was universal, regardless of political allegiances. The conversation continued as the afternoon wore on, with each member of the patrol gradually contributing to the exchange. Davies shared stories of his life in the Welsh coal mines, drawing parallels between the dangers of underground work and jungle warfare. Williams spoke of his clerical work in Manchester, expressing amazement at how different his current life was from his pre-war routine. As the afternoon wore on, the patrol established a temporary shelter using salvaged materials from the ruined village. The woman, who had introduced herself as Nurse Tanaka Michiko, gradually became less of an enemy and more of a fellow survivor. Her medical knowledge proved valuable when Morrison developed symptoms of heat exhaustion, and her gentle treatment of his condition earned the respect of the entire unit. The transformation was not immediate or complete. Decades of propaganda and military training could not be erased in a single afternoon. But something fundamental had shifted in the way these British soldiers viewed their Japanese counterpart. The clear lines between us and them had become blurred, replaced by a more complex understanding of shared humanity. When evening approached and the rain finally began to subside, Hayes faced a crucial decision. Military protocol demanded that he transport Nurse Tanaka to the nearest command post for interrogation and processing as a prisoner of war. But he also recognized that she posed no security threat, and that her medical skills might prove valuable to other wounded personnel they might encounter. More importantly, he had witnessed something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He had seen how a simple act of compassion could bridge the seemingly insurmountable divide between enemies. In offering water to a thirsty woman, in sharing food with someone who was hungry, in providing shelter to someone exposed to the elements, his patrol had discovered something profound about the nature of humanity and warfare. The decision to protect and care for Nurse Tanaka would have consequences that extended far beyond that rainy afternoon in Burma. Word of the incident would eventually reach higher command levels, where it would be documented as part of a broader pattern of British conduct during the final phases of the Burma campaign. Military historians would later note that such acts of compassion, while not officially sanctioned, were tacitly encouraged as part of Britain's commitment to maintaining moral authority, even in the midst of total war. For the local Burmese population, witnessing British soldiers care for a Japanese woman challenged their assumptions about the nature of military occupation. Many had expected the returning British forces to seek revenge for the years of Japanese brutality. Instead, they saw an example of mercy that suggested a different kind of military culture, one that valued human dignity even when dealing with former enemies. The story of Nurse Tanaka and Sergeant Hayes would eventually become part of the larger narrative of reconciliation that characterized the post-war period in Southeast Asia. Unlike other theaters of World War II, where bitterness and resentment persisted for decades, the Burma campaign produced numerous examples of cross-cultural understanding that helped lay the groundwork for peaceful relations in the years that followed. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the soldiers themselves. For Hayes and his men, the encounter with Nurse Tanaka represented a moment of moral clarity in the midst of moral confusion. They had been trained to see the Japanese as fanatical enemies, incapable of normal human emotion or deserving of basic compassion. The reality they discovered was far more complex and ultimately more hopeful. In the years that followed the war, several members of Hayes's patrol would maintain correspondence with Nurse Tanaka, who survived the war and eventually returned to Japan. Their letters, preserved in military archives, provide a unique window into the process of reconciliation between former enemies. They reveal how shared experiences of hardship and humanity could overcome even the most deeply ingrained prejudices. The monsoon rains that had brought Sergeant Hayes and his patrol to that ruined village had also washed away some of the artificial barriers that war had created between human beings. In choosing compassion over protocol, mercy over military necessity, these ordinary soldiers had demonstrated that even in the darkest moments of human conflict, the light of basic human decency could still shine through. As night fell over the Burmese jungle and the patrol prepared to continue their mission, they carried with them not just a former enemy who had become a fellow traveler, but also a new understanding of what it meant to be human in an inhuman time. The sign that had marked Nurse Tanaka as an enemy had been discarded, replaced by something far more powerful: the recognition that in the end, we are all simply people trying to survive in a world that too often seems determined to tear us apart. The rain had stopped, but the lessons learned in that muddy clearing would continue to resonate long after the last shots of the war had been fired and the last prisoners had been repatriated. In choosing humanity over hatred, these British soldiers had written a small but significant chapter in the larger story of how wars end and how former enemies become friends. If you found this story of unexpected humanity in the midst of war as moving as we did, please consider subscribing to our channel for more incredible historical narratives like this one. We bring you the untold stories, the forgotten moments, and the human experiences that shaped our world. Don't forget to hit that like button if this story touched your heart or taught you something new about the complexities of warfare and human compassion. Your likes help us reach more people who appreciate these important historical stories. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever heard similar stories of compassion during wartime? Do you know of other instances where enemies showed mercy to each other? Share your thoughts, your own family stories, or simply let us know what you learned from Sergeant Hayes and Nurse Tanaka's encounter in that rain-soaked Burmese village. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these powerful historical stories to light. Every subscription, like, and comment makes a difference in preserving and sharing these crucial moments from our past. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.